Hello, my fellow Victorians. You may have heard Donald Trump call the American media fake news, and you may think the Australian media is not like that. You may think they're not politically motivated and usually tell the truth in a balanced way. Certainly our media want us to think so. Unfortunately, often this is not the case. Our media can be just as politically driven as the US media. They can distort their reporting, invent false or dishonest news reports, withhold important information, and they can edit their stories to leave you with perceptions that suit their own political agenda. Please don't think perceptions aren't important. They're very important. The impressions and perceptions you're left with will shape your own opinions and belief, and our media know this. I'm going to look at one news video from a mainstream media outlet in Melbourne and point out some of the dishonest tricks they use. In the next few videos, I'd like to look at some more examples. One big problem is that much of what the media do can be very subtle, and if you're not aware of what they do, it can go unnoticed, and you find yourself accepting what they say. I hope that after this video, you'll be able to spot their dishonest techniques more easily. Let's start with a recent news report from a major Melbourne news network. Please see link 1 in the description below. Notice what they say in their voiceover. The Premier was forced to make a hasty escape because of protesters. Brett Sutton was abused at Parliament House. Protesters were vitriolic, that is bitter and malicious, and made death threats against a politician. Really? Now let's look at the video in detail. First, where is the hasty escape by Daniel Andrews? There is a small handful of protesters outside the venue where the Premier spoke. This is pretty standard for most protests, and based on what we see, this protest was pretty mild and well disciplined. The voiceover says that protesters gate-crashed his tour. So where is the evidence of that? I could hear no sound of protesters inside the venue where the Premier spoke. They were only outside. It was noisy, but overall pretty peaceful. Second, was Brett Sutton abused outside Parliament House? Sure, some people were shouting unpleasant things, like calling him a scumbag, but that's pretty standard for most protests. After all, a former ALP Prime Minister, Paul Keating, used to call people scumbags on a regular basis, and the ABC did not object. In fact, in one of their current affairs programs, I recall they said it was just ordinary speech. So is Sutton and the media upset because of the use of this term scumbag? And where is the vitriol, the malice and the bitterness? It all looks pretty ordinary and well behaved as far as I can see. I don't think anyone is saying anything we could call vitriolic. Calling someone a scumbag is not really vitriol. For Paul Keating it was done commonly and was fair game. Far worse things are said in other protests. Apparently the best the media can do is show one woman confronting Brett Sutton and pointing her finger at him. Where is the vitriol? We didn't hear much of what was said by any of the protesters. This is what I would call a bitter and threatening protest. Please see link 2 in the description below. Notice that these are members of the CFMEU protesting, and these CFMEU protesters are part of the ALP supporter base. This is the kind of stuff that Daniel Andrews and Brett Sutton are well accustomed to, and have to deal with on a regular basis. So what's going on? Did they get frightened over the small, peaceful, well-disciplined protests in Bendigo and at Parliament House? It's all a bit rich and a bit of an exaggeration as far as I can see. Something is very wrong here. Next, let's look at the media's claim that death threats were made against a politician because of the proposed pandemic legislation. The voiceover suggests that more than one death threat was made, and you might think the media would select one of the more serious threats to prove their point. Which one did they choose? Please stop the video and read what the letter says. I don't think this is a death threat at all. It came with a condom and the recipient was invited to enjoy some of the sender's herpes, which is pretty disgusting. But where is the threat? I don't see any. If we're going to be technically accurate, the recipient is invited to enjoy the sender's herpes. Yes, this is disgusting. But there's no compulsion, no death threats, no threats of violence, or anything the sender would do that is outside the control of the politician. What I see is an invitation, and the politician remains in full control of what might happen at all times. Is this the best the media can do? Is this one of the most serious death threats made? So what is going on here? The media seem to be exaggerating everything they can. First, the Premier's exit from the speaking engagement. Then Brett Sutton's exit from Parliament. Finally, this letter and its message. Remember, the media accuse protesters of intrusion, gate-crashing, abuse, vitriol, and sending death threats. As far as I can tell, all this is either false, misinterpretation, or an unjustified exaggeration. Why are they doing this? Well, first, by accusing the protesters of bitterness and malice, and saying that they've made death threats, they paint the protesters as a lawless, violent, and dangerous group of people. I think most people would say that such behaviour disqualifies such people from participating in any democratic debate or political process, and many would say these people don't deserve to be listened to. Instead, violent people who make death threats should be opposed in every way. So what do the media do? Let's take a careful look. The media now have an excuse not to let us hear what the protesters are saying. Notice that we're not told anything of their objections to the proposed pandemic law. There's a woman with a loudspeaker, but we don't hear much of what she says. Basically, we learn nothing at all of what these protesters' view is. Convenient, isn't it? The government is getting a controversial law passed, and because of a lie and a distortion, the media take away these people's right to be heard and take away all of what they have to say. I would have thought it was the media's job to tell us what people have to say, so we can have an intelligent debate over the issues. But instead, the media invent lies and distort events so they can suppress what protesters have to say, and take away their right to be heard and their right to free speech on political issues. And who does this media deception help? It only helps the state government get their proposed pandemic law passed, and no one else. So how does the media do this? How do they turn a relatively peaceful protest into a life-threatening, malicious and bitter protest by dangerous, violent people? Well, anyone who edits videos knows the following. You can take material from just about any video you have. Then you can take just the bits you want out of those videos. Then you can string all the pieces of video together in a way that supports your voiceover. That is, by careful editing, you can produce a video that supports what you want to say. Also, you can leave your audience with certain impressions. You can do this by making accusations in the voiceover, as is done in this news piece, or by associating violent, unpleasant or other video clips with the people in your video. The impression you leave your audience with may be entirely false and unjustified, but it's often done by our media, and it's not hard to do. Let me give you an example of where I deliberately created a false impression in a video. When my children were very young, I used to edit videos we recorded from television. By leaving out the profanity, the sex scenes and other unpleasant sections, I could change the nature of the video entirely. Instead of it being obscene, it would become quite acceptable. And the overall impression the viewer was left with was changed entirely, simply by a bit of careful editing. The problem with these false impressions or false perceptions is that they stay with you. You tend to remember them and take them away with you. Now let's look at some more subtle and unfair tricks used by our news media that we may not be aware of. Notice Martin Pakula's sound bites. Notice how they're not part of a larger speech, nor are they rushed in any way. Instead, they appear to be well composed, made calmly and forcefully, without any fear of interruption. It appears that Martin Pakula had time to think about and compose his answer, then make his response in a calm, collected and forceful manner. Notice also how his soundbites fit in well with the false and exaggerated story the news media is creating. The statements Martin Pakula makes are very good and convincing. So what's going on here? I think the media have given Martin Pakula forewarning of what has happened and what the important issues are. Then they gave him the time and opportunity to make a composed, calm and forceful response. This would be all right if it were done to both sides. But look at how they treat David Davis later on in the report. The soundbite they use from his speech is very weak. Really nothing more than an insinuation and not a forceful or convincing statement. I'm sure David Davis had far more convincing things to say, but this weak insinuation is all the media decided to show from his speech. Then look at how Matthew Guy, the opposition leader, is treated. Apparently the question put to him is that what David Davis said may be inciting violence. This is what was put to Matthew Guy to answer. Not really the same thing, is it? The media aid one side and put the other side on the defensive. This is not treating both sides in the same way. To Matthew Guy's credit, he sees right through the media's trickery and answers the issue that he thinks is most important. The media are obviously not treating both sides in the same way. One side they aid and give opportunity to dominate, the other side they try to put on the back foot. And what is the impression you're left with from all of this? As far as I can tell, Martin Pakula appears to be on top of his game and in charge of the situation, while the opposition appears to be in a bit of disarray and not making any strong arguments. See how the media can distort events, take sides, and push political agendas, and leave you with the impressions and perceptions they want you to have. Notice how subtle they are at what they do. If you're not the type of person who asks questions all the time, it's easy for you to accept what the media says on face value. This is not fair or balanced reporting in any way, shape or form. Now let's look at how the media use their lie and their distortion of events from Bendigo. First, they try and put Matthew Guy on the back foot by claiming that Liberal speakers are promoting violence, referring to the false story they invented about vitriol and death threats from the protesters at Bendigo. Then, notice how Daniel Andrews knows what the media did and uses it to accuse Scott Morrison of trying to get the votes of violent extremists, again referring to the protesters at Bendigo.
I'm committed to doing what has to be done and not about chasing through doublespeak the votes of extremists or their preferences.
Then look at the string of questions the media puts to the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, where they use their lies and distortions to suggest and question the PM about supporting the views of violent Bendigo protesters.
Well, I was very clear yesterday in denunciating any violence, threats or intimidation that is applied against anyone. And we have absolutely no truck with that whatsoever. I couldn't have been clearer about denunciating the violence and the threats and the intimidation. They have no place in Australia's public policy debate whatsoever.
On that note, why did you express sympathy for the protesters even when it's
Well, as I said, I completely and totally and continue to denunciate any violence, any threat, any intimidation, and any suggestion that I have not done that is completely false. I have been completely clear on that issue.
Do you have sympathy for those demonstrators?
I don't have sympathy for violence. I don't have sympathy for intimidation or threats whatsoever. And on those issues, then of course not. And as I have encouraged people not to participate in that, including those who would number themselves amongst the Liberal Party ranks. I've said absolutely they shouldn't be participating in any violent, and any suggestion that I would is patently absurd. I have sympathy for Australians who've had a gutful of governments telling them what to do over the last 2 years.
So you have sympathy for their frustration, but not sympathy for their actions, is that what you're saying?
I think you're making an assumption that the frustration that Australians feel is only limited to a small group of people who have engaged in violence and threats and intimidation and have worked against the vaccination program. I have no sympathy with that agenda.
What's going on here? First, the media make false claims that take away the voice of protesters. Then they use their false claims to make sure that no one dares to side with these protesters who oppose Daniel Andrews' pandemic legislation. I would say the media's plan is to help Daniel Andrews by silencing anyone who may oppose his pandemic legislation. What we see is that the news media are not impartial observers reporting the truth. They are themselves involved in the political process. They promote Daniel Andrews' proposed pandemic legislation and try to silence anyone who opposes it. The media are not journalists. They're behaving like political activists. What I find interesting is that the Nazis back in the 1930s used to send their brown shirts, the SA, to beat up their political opposition. Apparently that doesn't need to be done anymore. Those opposed to the ALP can be silenced just as effectively by a few lies invented by the media. How times have changed. So what have we learned? I hope you now know some of the dishonest tricks the news media use to fool and deceive us. And there is a lot more they do, and I hope to cover that in coming videos. Just like in the USA, our media can be just as bad and possibly worse. We have our Brian Stelters of CNN, we have our Washington Post, and so on. Our media can be just as dishonest, biased and politically motivated. Please stay safe from our Victorian state government and their police, and thank you for your time.